Hey fellow fishing fanatic, I know walking into a tackle shop can be incredibly overwhelming, especially when you're a beginner bass angler and you really don't know what lure to use, when to use it, or if you just need all of them to throw all the time, you know? So in today's video, I'm gonna walk you through the typical types of fishing lures, as well as how to use them and when to use them. So I know I'm about to spit a lot of information at you, so I want you to hold on, slowly digest it all, but I promise at the end of the video, I will give you 5 or 6 lures that you can go and grab and that'll get you catching bass right away. My name's Wesley Littlefield with YourBassGuy.com, and crankbaits are one of my favorite lures to use. And you can walk into the tackle shop and see just a wall of crankbaits, all kinds of different styles and everything, and it can be really overwhelming. It was for me at first, but now that I understand a little bit of when to use what crankbait and what the different kinds of crankbaits are best, then it's not as overwhelming. I can go in, get what I need, or go online and order what I need. So with that said, what are the most common crankbaits? So typically nowadays, I've got a square bill crankbait tied on, and this is for fishing shallow water. Typically a square bill's gonna run 3 to 5 feet deep on average. Sometimes they run a little deeper, sometimes they run a little shallower, but there's the square bill. You've got the flat-sided crankbait, which is better for like cool water situations, and sometimes they float so they won't dive as deep, and sometimes they actually sink so you can get them down to deeper depths. And then you've got like I call it a round bill crankbait, just a regular crankbait, and those can go all kinds of different depths. They can be a deep diving crankbait, which can run anywhere from 15 to 25, 30 feet deep. So there's all kinds of different crankbaits. That's one of the best lures for beginners to begin on, because there's not a lot to master with it. You cast it out there, and as long as you feel it contacting the bottom, you're doing it right. Now let's move on to probably the most popular and most recommended bass lure, and that is the jig. Now, the jig is also one of my favorites, and I really just started learning how to fish it earlier this year. I had one day where I just locked it in my hand and I just hammered the bass with it, just because it's just a very versatile bait. You know, the situation that I was fishing called for really swimming it and then occasionally dragging it or bumping it into stuff, so it doesn't limit you. I'll say that. You know, there's all kinds of different jigs, whether you're looking at like a football head jig, a swim jig, finesse jig. There's so many different kinds of jigs that can also be overwhelming. My recommendation for beginners is to grab like a swim jig and a football head jig and stick with those. You can do most things with those two jigs. You know, if you need to drag it along the bottom, you can drag a swim jig along the bottom. A swim jig comes through cover a lot better, so I really would push you in the direction of a swim jig, but also a football head jig is good for just casting out there and dragging it along the bottom. And you can swim it back, but I've had the tendency with football head jigs to get hung up on brush piles and stuff, so I tend to stay away from them a little bit more, fishing cover, and go with like a swim jig or a flipping jig. But overall, you need to get a jig. Colors to use would be like a green pumpkin, a black and blue, a white, and with a little chartreuse or some kind of natural looking color, clear kind of color. Those 3 jigs you can use pretty much any conditions. It's gonna cover all the conditions that you're gonna fish. You can fish a jig anywhere. Like, there's not a bad place to fish a jig. So that's jigs. Let's move on to, it's kind of related to a jig, and that is the chatterbait, or some people call it a bladed jig. It's kind of like a hybrid between a jig, a spinnerbait, and a crankbait all mashed into one. So literally my 3 favorite lures turned into one, the chatterbait, and it doesn't get any better than that. Now, a chatterbait really isn't designed for fishing in thick, heavy cover. Now, you can get away fishing it in grass and stuff, so don't be afraid to throw it in a little bit of grass, rip it through the grass. Fishing it around rocks is great, like a crankbait would be, skipping it up underneath docks, along docks, and on the edge of laydowns is great. But like I said, I don't throw them up in there because I tend to lose them in the brush pile but that's a chatterbait. There's not a bad place to fish it. Once again, I would stick with the real basic colors, except for one on the chatterbait. I would really push for like a crawfish color, because chatterbaits in the spring are great, and the spring colors, for whatever reason, crawfish colored, that red and orange color, they just bite it. So I would also get 4 chatterbaits for that. The weights, I tend to stick anywhere, 3/8 ounce is a little bit heavy, but right around that range. I try not to go ½ ounce. That's just way too heavy in my opinion, unless you're just fishing really deep. 3/8 ounce or less is where I tend to go with chatterbaits. If you're fishing really shallow, go on the light end, and you can't go wrong with the chatterbait. So next on that list was the spinnerbait. The spinnerbait's just one of my go-to confidence lures that I absolutely love. And that's because, once again, it's a very versatile bait, and it's not hard to fish. It's real simple to tie on, it's real simple to rig, it's real simple to just cast out there and get fishing. I really like a spinnerbait for fishing around cover, brush, even in the grass a little bit. Sometimes it gets a little hung up and it doesn't properly function just right, but for the most part, if I'm fishing around wood, if I'm fishing around docks, if I'm fishing around rocks, I'm gonna be throwing a spinnerbait sometime during the day. Color selection, can't go wrong with the same colors you would use with a jig. You know, that black and blue, green pumpkin kind of colored, a white and chartreuse color. You're not gonna go wrong with those. Now, as a spinnerbait, you do have to choose your blades, and it does matter, but for starting out, just go with willow blades, or you can do a willow blade and a Colorado blade. That way you kind of hit that medium sweet spot, and just go from there, shoot for that middle sweet spot, and then branch out from there. So another hard bait that looks very similar to crankbait, but it's not, and that's a jerkbait. Now, you've got like suspending jerkbaits and sinking jerkbaits, kind of like you would on the flat-sided crankbaits. Jerkbaits, you don't cast out there and just reel back. You actually jerk them back. You got to twitch it and move it a little bit differently. Now, jerkbaits are primarily like open water fishing. You know, you found a school of fish out in the middle of the lake, or not around a brush pile. You know, you can fish them along the top of a brush pile if it's real deep or whatever, but you're not going to be casting a jerkbait up into the brush pile and pulling it out, or casting it into grass. I don't use a jerkbait in grass. Those treble hooks and grass just don't go together, so I avoid grass. But other than that, I mean, jerkbaits are going to work in similar places as crankbaits would. Best time to use jerkbaits is actually like the pre-spawn, early spawn, which would be like a late pre-spawn really. So color selection on jerkbaits, I'm going to go with natural colors, maybe even like a bright color for dirty water. Other than that, I'm just going to keep it real simple on trying to match what your local fish is. So if you've got a lot of bluegill, match the bluegill pattern, or if you've got a lot of perch, match that yellow perch pattern, and you're going to get more bites that way because they're used to seeing that. You know, you can make it look a little bit different, and especially in your presentation, and that's what's going to trigger them to bite. So I would stick with natural patterns when choosing a jerkbait. Okay, on to a giant category that I'm just going to call soft plastics. We've got plastic worms, Senkos, we've got paddle tails, flukes, preacher baits, stick baits kind of like a Senko. The list just goes on and on and on with plastics, and these are my go-to when it gets tough, especially like a Senko. It's just like not guaranteed to catch fish, but right there below it, that if you can't catch them on a Senko, they're probably not biting. Now, with soft plastics actually comes rigging the soft plastics, and that is a whole nother video in itself. But there's several different rigs that you can use, like the Texas rig, which is one of my favorites, a Carolina rig, a wacky rig, which is another one of my favorites. There's the Ned rig, the shaky head rig, umbrella rig, which you use soft plastics on. The drop shot rig is another one that I'm forgetting, and I'm sure there's others that I'm forgetting. There's just so much you can do with soft plastics that I highly recommend the new angler get a bag of Senkos and maybe some paddle tails, some like 7 to 8 inch worms, and go from there. Because you can use the paddle tails, you can put those on like your jig, you can put them on your chatterbait, your bladed jig, you can put them on your spinnerbait to rig them to bulk up the profile, and then you can also put them on a regular jig head and swim them like a Damiki rig. So I'm gonna stop it there, and then we're gonna move on to topwaters. Topwater fishing is some of the most fun that you'll ever have, because you literally get to see the fish explode on your lure. You don't just feel it, you get to feel it and see it. So every beginner should get some topwaters. I recommend like a whopper plopper, a buzzbait, and a popper to start off with. But my favorite is fishing frogs, specifically a hollow body frog, but they also have like soft plastic frogs that you can kind of work like a buzz bait and buzz it across the top, and they work really well. Fishing topwaters are, you know, you want maybe a slight chop on the water, but relatively calm, and what topwater you're using will determine kind of where you should fish it. So the way I typically simplify it is, if it's got treble hooks, I'm not fishing it around any kind of cover, you know, like grass or wood. If it's got like a hollow body frog, which has the hooks pretty much covered, I'll fish it anywhere, you know, especially if it looks natural in that area. Now, color selection, I would say get you like a bone colored spook, a hollow body frog in black, or, you know, a black buzzbait, a natural colored whopper plopper, and go from there. Now, one lure that I don't use often enough probably, and it's usually because they're kind of expensive, and that's actually a swim bait. I've got a few, I've used them, I've caught fish with them. They're just not my confidence lures, and so I really don't recommend them for beginners. But these are lures that we're gonna talk about, and that's the swim baits. There's like hard plastic swim baits, which kind of resemble a crankbait without the bill, and they can be anywhere from little bitty to, I mean, we're talking like trout size, 16-inch swim baits. Those are for really big bass. Typically those guys are out in California, so if you're a California guy, you know all about like a glide bait or a swim bait. But typically, you know, if I'm trying to catch a 4 or 5 pounder, that swim bait's that big, it's plenty big enough. So color selection is really up to you. I recommend sticking with natural colors with swim baits. You know, so if you've got bluegill, go with the bluegill pattern. If you've got a bunch of shad you're fishing around, go with the shad pattern. Go with natural patterns. But where to fish them, I'm not gonna fish it around wood or grass or anything that I can get tangled up and have to break my line off. That typically means I'm fishing it open water, maybe along a bluff edge or around the rocks that I know I can get it back. All right, the final two categories that we're gonna talk about today are often forgotten, and that is spoons, number one. Spoons, if you don't know what it is, it's literally like a piece of metal that's shiny, reflects really well, or some of them are painted, and it's most of the time got a treble hook on it. Sometimes, you know, it might just have a single hook or a double hook on it. They imitate like a shad, or some, if it's painted properly, a perch, a bluegill. They're excellent lures. Typically they're more of like a cool water lure, although I do troll with them sometimes in the summer a little bit. Main thing about spoons and why I don't recommend them for beginners is because they twist, so you have to have a swivel. You have to fish it with a swivel, otherwise you're going to be cussing mad because your line's all twisted and it's just no fun. And the last one is blade baits. A blade bait is another chunk of metal, but it kind of actually looks like a flat-sided crankbait, except it's a lot thinner. It looks like a knife blade that's been made into a crankbait almost. These are heavy, and they're really designed for cool to cold water fishing, and almost like jigging is really the way I would think of fishing a blade bait. You can cast them and reel them back at, you know, specific targets, but most of the time it's a cool water technique, so you're going to be fishing it slow and really jigging it more than likely, which means you're going to be fishing them more out in the open. They have treble hooks or a double hook sometimes, so I tend to stay away from brush piles with them, but you can cast to like a piece of standing timber and bring it past it, or if you see the brush pile, cast right up next to it and bring it through, or bring it past it and trigger a bite. So you can fish them that way. Now, as I promised in the beginning of this video, I'm gonna tell you what you actually really need, and that is get you 3 jigs in 3 different colors. Like I said, a black jig or a black and blue jig, a green pumpkin jig, and then a white jig. And then get you 2 or 3 spinner baits. Probably 2 would be just fine. A couple different sizes would be great, and a couple different weights, or get the same weight. And then I'd get you 1 or 2 crankbaits, 1 or 2 chatterbaits, and then you absolutely have to have soft plastics. Get Senkos, 8-inch worms, and then learn how to rig them Texas rigged, a drop shot rig, and shaky head rig. And those 3 rigs right there will cover a lot for you and work really well in many different situations. And that's what you really need to get started bass fishing. Now, obviously, as you get into this, you see a cool lure and you're like, ooh, I want that, I want to learn that. Go buy it, learn it, have fun. But to keep yourself from getting overwhelmed, get those things at the store. Look for those specific things at the store, and you're not going to be so overwhelmed on, oh my gosh, what should I buy? What do I actually need? Now, I mentioned those rigs, and if you want to learn how to rig those rigs, I've got a video right below me that will teach you several different ways to rig soft plastic worms that you can use as a beginner. Super easy to do. Check that video out below me, and I'll see you in that one. But before then, remember that education is important, but fishing is essential.